I'm Emma and I'm your host for today. Today's session is Desert Island Specimens. We're joined by one of our mammal curators, Andy Currant. Andy works with mammal fossils from the last 1.8 million years, so the last ice age. So he's a very experienced excavator. You might have also seen him on Time Team, although he may not like me for mentioning that. But so today Andy's going to tell us about his 3 favourite specimens from the museum. So Andy, perhaps you could start by telling us what it is you actually do. How would you describe your job?
It's very difficult to describe. I do everything from sort of cradle to the grave to do with Ice Age mammals. I go out and look for them. When I find them, I dig them up. I clean them. I put them back together. I study them. I write about them. I lecture about them. I dream about them. You know, it's all the sad things that curators do, really. I've been doing it for quite a long time as well, so I know the particular collections I look after quite well, I hope.
And you've said yourself, I've heard you say that you've spent much of your working life down deep holes. How did it all start? How did you get to the museum to work where you are today?
I really don't know. I was painting hospital ceilings when I was about 18. And my mum phoned me up and she said, "There's a job at the museum, there's a job at the museum." She knew that I'd wanted to work here since I was about 8 years old. And I was then about 18 and I was waiting to go to university to study archaeology. And what I really wanted to do, though, was get a job, partly to earn some money, but also I didn't really know where archaeology was going. And so I came here and I got the job. I think I took the attitude that it was my job. So the other 200 applicants didn't really stand much of a chance, you know. So I took the place by storm. I ended up on fossil mammals slightly by mistake, I think. They were looking for somebody who could lift heavy bones. And that was really the only qualification they were interested in. And sadly, I was the beefiest one of the 6 people that joined at that time. So I got fossil mammals.
So for your first job in fossil mammals, what did you actually have to do? What were you asked to do?
One of my first jobs was sorting out the most hideous mess in one of the basement storerooms. After the Second World War, when most of the collections were evacuated to sort of tunnels and castles all over England, when the material came back here, it came back in slightly jumbled order. And the people who worked here in the 40s, 50s and 60s spent most of their time unpacking boxes and trying to find somewhere to put them. I arrived at the stage when the collections were basically sorted into major groups, but we were trying to regroup specific collections within that broader framework. And one of the first collections I worked on was the South American collection, which was in the old basement storeroom 39, a dark and dangerous place, and specimens were piled up the walls on high shelves, and one of my favourite specimens, the one behind me.
Yes, we can't ignore this much longer,
can't
really,
really
can we? This is your first
This is my first one. When I'm washed up on my desert island, I think that's safe down there. Yeah, this is one of the things I would like to be washed up with me. This is the skull of the giant ground sloth, Megatherium, which translates as big animal. Which tells you straight away it was one of the earliest fossil mammals that was described. It's got a nice, easy name. It's a friend of mine, and the reason it's a friend of mine is that in my very early days, up on the ladder at the far end of store 39, I was trying to move this around, and as you can probably see, it's quite a lumpy specimen. It was on its stand there, and I was trying to manoeuvre it forwards in order to pick it up, and I was about 5 shelves up at the back of the storeroom, and I had my arms through the ladder that I was on when it toppled forwards, and so I was trapped there with this thing in my arms. Over the next 20 minutes or so we got to know each other quite well. I don't know what it was saying to me. I seemed to be screaming quite a lot, and eventually somebody came down to help me. It took a while to get us apart. We sort of bonded during that period of time. But when the use of my arms came back a few days later, I went down to see it again, and I started working on it. I started trying to find out more about the specimen, where it had come from, who had collected it. And after a while, you do bond with your collection. It's never yours, it's the national collection, but you do develop this kind of intimate relationship between specimens, often because of particular instances that happen in the course of, one's long life at the museum. Curators tend to come in young and are taken out in pine boxes, so it's there's an inevitable sort of sequence of events, but on the way we do have quite a lot of fun. That was just one particular incident, but I think the big heavy end of my job came early on, and it's got lighter and lighter as time's gone on.
So this is really the skull of the giant ground sloth. Can you tell us about the sloth?
The giant ground sloth it's nearly the biggest of the extinct ground sloths from South America. They disappeared at the end of the Pleistocene period, about 12,000 years ago, probably as a result of the emergence of humans in that part of the world. It's not necessarily hunting, it was probably competition for resources like sheltered sites where these animals raised their young, places like caves. I've had the opportunity while I've been at the museum to go and work in South America on several occasions, and one of the places I went to is this wonderful site in southern Chile called the Mylodon Cave. Now, a Mylodon is a kind of ground sloth. It's a relative of this thing. This is about a 2.5 ton sloth. The Mylodon is about a 1 ton sloth. It's a slightly smaller animal, but they lived in these big caves in southern Chile. This is a particularly fine example. And the floor of this cave is covered in about 3 meters of sloth dung. That's about 12,000 years old.
Actually, I think we'll just stick one of those sloth dung pictures up on the screen. Hang on a minute, where is it?
There it is.
Beautiful.
There's a piece of sloth dung from the Mylodon Cave. Looks remarkably like a piece of modern dung. It's actually 12,000 years old. And we get remarkably well-preserved fossil DNA from these dung balls because they've been like a swab that's been all the way through the animal. So picked up quite a bit of DNA on the way.
And does anybody else want to ask anything about this particular sloth before we move on to the next specimen? Let me come over.
Oh, sorry, forgot about that. What was found in the dung? Remains of animals.
Well, you find what the animals were eating, and sloths seem to eat complete rubbish. They were eating yuccas and other very, very coarse vegetation. And as you can tell from 3 meters of dung on the floor, they ate quite a lot of it. It probably had a very low nutritional value. But you're picking up the remains of beetles. There are all the parasites that were on the animal itself, all sorts of ticks and horrible things that were crawling about in its fur. There's actually well-preserved fur of the animal known from this same cave. It's an absolutely superb site. So, we can do quite a lot even with balls of dung.
What kind of projects do you generally work on?
I tend to deal with whatever turns up, but it just so happens that in the course of my career, I've spent an alarming amount of my time down caves, which might seem a bit odd, but I was once your size, and I've grown very gradually. It's kind of exclusion process. When you're doing something you really don't enjoy, sometimes you sort of adapt to that environment by making it impossible to get into it anymore. And I think that's probably what I've done over the years.
And you've obviously worked on a considerable number of different types of dig. What would you say was your most exciting find?
I hate questions like that. The most exciting find is always the last one that you've made. I did do a dig in a little cave in Devon, Tornewton Cave, which is in a very quiet valley not far from a village called Ipplepen near Newton Abbot. And I spent many, many happy hours on my own at the back of this cave, down a very deep, dark hole, scraping away at the floor, week in, week out. And I was wedged in the cave. I had my knees either side of the fissure, and my shoulders were jammed in it. I was reaching down as far as I could with a long-handled spoon, digging below me very carefully for small mammal remains in this sediment. And my second favourite object. The other thing I would very much like to take with me is one of the delightful little specimens I found down that hole. It's part of the jaw of a clawless otter. This is the only place in Britain where clawless otters have ever been found. It's an incredible assemblage of bones, and you have to remember that I was working on this assemblage of bones essentially upside down for quite a few days, so it's something that's made quite a big impression on me. We found these otter remains embedded in deposits which are also of a remarkable number of shrew remains, which is not too uncommon, and extraordinary numbers of ducks. And you just never ever find ducks in caves. It's a preposterous assemblage of animals. And I spent a great deal of time wondering what all these ducks were doing in the cave. And we discovered some years later that under unusual conditions, when ducks pick up a disease known as avian botulism, they immediately seek somewhere dark and then they die, often in very large numbers. And what we appear to have at Tor Newton Cave is an example of a big pile of dead ducks that have run into the back of the cave and breathed their last. And that pile of dead ducks contained a very strong toxin, and all the little predators that went in after them, like the shrews and the otters, had their last meal of duck, and then they died themselves. And so we've got this big pile of dead things in this very tiny little cave in a valley in Devon. Provided you don't dwell on the morbid side of it too much, it's huge fun. But I would definitely like to have this with me to remind me of those happy hours upside down on my own at the back of a cave in Devon.
So what are you thinking about when you're down there? You're obviously there for quite some time on your own in a dark place.
You think about things like how I can breathe. Excuse me, I've done something absolutely stupid here and left my telephone on.
I forgot to tell everybody to turn off their mobile
phones. Please turn
phones.
off your mobile phones, just like I'm going to. You think about things like the next meal, when you're going to get out of there, if you can ever move again. Can you go away, please?
I've had a conversation with them there.
I don't know if you actually think of very much at all. All the blood's rushing around your head, and what you're trying to do is focus on the material underneath. You've got a light on top of your head, so you can't really move your head very much, otherwise you can't see what you're doing. And no, it's almost like a kind of meditation when you're digging at the back of a cave. You can't do anything else but dig. And your mind certainly doesn't wander, because if it wanders, you lose the will to live completely, and you just go to sleep or slip down the hole or something like that. It's a very, very strange environment to work in. You ought to try it. It's good for you.
Yeah, maybe. Well, I can't not ask you about Time Team, and actually all those hours that you've spent in a cave isn't perhaps what we see on Time Team. So tell us about your work there.
I tend to get dragged into time teams when they find large numbers of bones, regardless of their age. They're not usually Ice Age mammals when we do time teams. But if they're digging holes in the ground where there's any chance of bones turning up, I tend to get taken along. I know Phil Harding quite well. He's a good friend of mine going back many years, and I've got to know the other members of the team pretty well. They're good fun, and the programme really is what you see. It's 3 days of very, very concentrated effort, often quite hard work. Sometimes you're trying to salvage a very, very difficult situation if not too much is turning up. Or you're trying desperately to cope with hundreds and hundreds of objects pouring out the ground. You can't really predict what's going to happen. They're really fun programmes to do, and I think the team thoroughly enjoy themselves.
So what normally would bring you to a site? Would you be looking for something particular at a certain site, or would you normally be called up by a member of the public or geologist?
It's a mix of things. I mean, we respond to new finds, obviously. But what I in fact, my research work is putting together a sequence of the history of, very specifically, the British fossil mammal fauna. I'm looking at the way the animals in Britain change through time in response to the big climatic variations that we see during the ice ages. So 120,000 years ago, Trafalgar Square, we've hippopotamus remains pouring out of the ground. At a quarry in Staffordshire where we were last October, during the middle of a cold stage, I've got mammoths and woolly rhinos coming out of the ground. It's you can't deal with everything that's found. There's a huge amount turning up all the time in quarries and on building sites. But what I try to do is go around and assess the value of what's turning up, and we concentrate our efforts in places where we're trying to resolve questions, and they're often questions like, were there people around associated with these animals? Is there any trace of archaeology? Is there any trace of butchery? And we're looking for environmental evidence that goes with the animals, so we're looking for plant remains, beetle remains, means of interpreting what we're finding. There are fossil mammals almost everywhere, if you look hard enough. What we do is concentrate on the sites where we're getting the very best quality information for the amount of time we can put in on it.
What's your third specimen?
My third specimen is up here. I don't know if you can bring him up on the screen. This is a particular favourite of mine. I've spent an awful lot of my life working on fossil voles, as you may know. I've identified hundreds of thousands of voles over the years. I don't do so much vole work these days. My eyes are going a bit. I tend to work on mammoths and rhinos now because I can see them. But for the first 20 years I was at the museum, voles were my big thing. And there are a lot of voles in the British Pleistocene. There are very large numbers of them. They're animals that were, by and large, eaten by birds of prey and then sicked up at specific spots in the landscape, quite often in the entrance to caves. So you find very, very large numbers of small mammals in cave entrances, and that's one of the places I tend to look. This particular specimen has a bit of a story that goes with it. This is the holotype of an animal called Mimimys newtoni, which is an extinct vole from the coast of East Anglia. And some years ago, a friend of mine, David Mayhew, who was doing his PhD thesis at the time, his doctoral thesis, wanted to borrow this specimen to study. And at the time, although it was in this elegant little box, it was stuck to a small piece of card which had Mimimys newtoni on it, and then there was a blob of glue, and in the middle of the blob of glue was the tooth. And what we usually do to get this glue off, organic glue, made of sort of boiled up animal feet or something, is suck the teeth, because there's no other effective way of getting the glue off. It's a bit of a dodgy business, but curators do worse than that, I can assure you. And while I was sucking the vole tooth, somebody came into my room. We had a conversation. At the end of the conversation, the tooth wasn't there anymore. So I thought, oh dear, what have I done with it? Well, it was fairly clear that I'd swallowed it. So I went running down to the Paleontology laboratory, telling everybody that I'd swallowed a holotype. They laughed, you know. People.
And a holotype is?
Holotype is the name-bearing specimen. It's about the most important kind of scientific specimen there is. That is Mimimys newtoni. Everything else that's assigned to the species is paired with that one. So these are not things you lose, and they're certainly not things you swallow. So there was an inevitable end to this. I spent a very, very uncomfortable night. And the following morning I was to be found in the acid lab yard with a sieve. And got it back. And it was very clean as well. I'd given huge amounts of bicarbonate of soda to make sure that my stomach acids didn't do any damage to it. And I sent it off to Dave Mayhew, telling him that whatever he did, he wasn't putting it in his mouth. So sadly, the story got out.
Where it came from, he wouldn't have put it in his mouth. But did he know?
He did know. He did find out. There was. I thought I'd got away with it, but a year later, a symposium dinner at Sydney Sussex College, as the port went one way, a big tub of Andrew's liver salts came down the table the other way. So, yeah, people got to hear about that, I'm afraid. It's one of the things I was famous for many years ago. But I'd certainly like to have that with me to remind all the fun I've had with small mammals and all the free work you have to do with them. Yeah.
I presume you're not still using that technique to get them off the glass.
No. We tend to send them down to the lab where they clean them up with ultrasonics these days.
Well, after working in this field for 32 years, you've obviously worked on many different projects, many different mammals. But what would be your dream project to work on?
What would I like? Where would I like to see my way out? I'd really like... something I've always wanted to do is dig a lion den, a fossil lion den. They do exist in Britain. There was one very famous one in the Mendip Hills, but that was dug out in the 1830s. I'm a bit late for that. I've actually been down into the cave. There's not very much left. I've worked on the collection, the most beautiful material, which is now in the museum at Taunton. But I'd love to dig a lion den because lions, probably uniquely amongst mammalian predators, don't chew the bones up. Almost everything we work with, hyenas, wolves, they tend to make a mess of the bones. Lions lick them clean and leave them alone. And as a paleontologist, having nice, undamaged bones is certainly something I'd love to do.
Where might you find a lion cave like that?
Well, I'm hoping that in this same area of Somerset something might turn up. We're still looking. You know, you wonder what curators do at weekends. That's what they do.
At this point, does anybody else want to ask anything about the specimens that we've already been looking at? Look, complete silence. Everybody's completely stunned.
You can buy your sucking vole teeth in the bookshop.
Well, on your desert island, you're taking your 3 specimens, the Megatherium skull, the otter jaw, and the vole tooth. You're allowed to take one book and a part of the Natural History Museum building, or perhaps a photo of that part of the building, because I presume it might be a little large. What would they be?
It's a very difficult one. I don't know what I'd take with me. I think one of the things I'd like to take with me is probably the paleontological notes and memoirs of the late Hugh Faulkner. Hugh Faulkner was one of my heroes, and he worked on elephants and rhinos, and I think quite like a lot of people who work in the museum, he didn't really get time in the course of his life to write up what he knew. Unfortunately, somebody came along after he died and wrote his notes up for him. So I've never had the time to sit down and read all of that. I'd love to do that. As for the building, I don't know. I think I'd want to take one of those big terracotta models of a Mylodon, of one of the sloths. Now, I know it looks like a lion, but it's actually based on one of the sloths, the ones that you see right along the top of the museum on the outside.
Told off the evil spirits.
I think you can work out why my boat's sunk now, can't you?
And what do you think you will leave behind when you leave the museum?
An awful lot of work for somebody else, I hope. I hope the collections will actually be in a better state than when I found them. The Second World War made a mess of the museum and its collections, and I think over the last 30 years we've sorted out those issues and we've really made a huge amount of progress. I spend much of my time researching specimens, looking at the archives, reassociating people's notes with the things that they found. One of the things that begins to get to you when you've been here a long time is that although you can see behind you lots and lots of specimens, what's not immediately apparent is the people behind those specimens. And I've done a huge amount of work on the people behind the specimens. Yeah.
And how does something turn into a fossil?
It doesn't. This is bone. All of these things are bone. They're not altered really very much at all. These have taken on a little bit of iron from their surroundings. Through time, that replacement can continue. And it's a very, very slow process. In tropical environments, the process which you would call fossilization or mineralization can take place very quickly. It can happen in a few years. In the Canadian Arctic, for instance, bone can lie around on the surface, unburied, as bone for hundreds of years, and it's really not altered very much at all. So a fossil originally meant something that was dug up, and we use fossil in those terms, in a very simple term. It's not fossilized, in other words, not mineralized, and in a completely arbitrary way, the division between what I do and what zoologists do in this building is taken at 10,000 radiocarbon years ago. And anything that's older than that I deal with, and anything that's younger than that goes to zoology. It's very arbitrary.
Does anybody else want to say anything before we close? Well then, finally, just one more question. What are you going to do on your desert island?
I will inevitably start digging. I've been digging since I was big enough to hold a spoon. I quite seriously, as a child, I undermined my dad's newly made garden path. When we moved, I dug a shaft into the chalk when I was about 10 or 11, which went down a very long way. I found fossil echinoderms and things. I can't stop digging. So I'm sure somewhere I would find a little cave or interesting river deposit, which I just have to take apart. Once you start doing that kind of thing, you can't stop.
Unfortunately, we won't find out what that is either. Andy Currant, thank you very much for sharing your desert island specimens with us. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to our web audience. If you keep your eyes as well on our internet site, nhm.ac.uk Darwin Centre, you'll be able to have a look at our forthcoming events in the Darwin Centre space. But until we see you again, thank you very much for coming along today, and finally, thank you very much to Andy Currant.
Thank you very much.